The waiting room was filled with the soft hum of conversations, the rustling of papers, and the occasional sound of a child coughing. People came and went. Nurses checked charts, and the smell of antiseptic hung in the air like a reminder that this place was meant for healing. But for Amara Johnson, sitting quietly on a hard plastic chair, the hospital did not feel like a place of care. It felt like a test. She had come in not because of something life-threatening, but because of something important, something personal. Amara had been feeling unwell for weeks. Fatigue, dizziness, shortness of breath. Her friends urged her to see a doctor, so she finally made time to come to the hospital. She believed, like anyone else, that she would be welcomed, checked, and treated with respect. But as she looked around at the busy nurses in their blue scrubs, she could not shake off a nervous feeling. She told herself it was nothing. After all, she had worked too hard in her life to let fear control her now. When the doctor walked in, tall, confident, wearing his white coat and a stethoscope hanging loosely around his neck, the room seemed to shift. Patients sat up straighter. Nurses followed his lead. He was used to being in charge. His presence commanded attention. And then his eyes landed on Amara. At first, he did not say anything. He walked over, glanced at her file, then at her clothes. She was dressed simply in jeans and a hoodie. Her hair was pulled back in a bun, and she sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. His expression tightened. "What are you doing here?" His voice cut through the room. Amara looked up, unsure if he was talking to her. I am here for a consultation," she said softly. The doctor's eyebrows rose. He looked around at the staff, almost as if making a point. The nurses glanced at one another but kept their eyes down. Then he leaned closer, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You aren't welcome here." The word struck her like a slap. She froze, her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. The waiting room went silent. Even the distant beeping of a monitor seemed to pause. Patients turned their heads. Nurses shifted uncomfortably. But no one said a word. Amara felt the weight of the stares pressing on her. Her throat tightened. She wanted to explain herself, to ask why, to demand respect. But the words would not come. She simply sat there, holding on to her dignity with every ounce of strength she had left. The doctor continued, his tone sharper now. "We don't need people like you wasting our time. There are real patients who deserve treatment. If you know what is good for you, you'll leave." His finger pointed at the door, steady and firm. In that moment, Amara felt an entire lifetime of memories rushing through her. Memories of being underestimated in school, of being told she would never amount to much, of doors closed in her face because people could not see past the surface of her skin. But she also remembered the nights she stayed awake studying, the sacrifices she made, the battles she had already fought and won. She wanted to stand up and shout, to tell him that he was wrong, that she was just as deserving of care as anyone else in that room. But instead she sat in silence, not because she was weak, but because she knew her silence would speak louder than his cruelty. She knew that responding with anger in that moment would only feed his pride. So she stood slowly, her body calm, her expression steady. She looked at the doctor, then at the nurses, then at the patients watching her. She said nothing. She simply picked up her bag and walked toward the door. Each step felt heavy but also powerful, like she was carrying more than just her own pain. She was carrying the weight of everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. Behind her, the doctor scoffed. "Exactly. That's what I thought." His voice was smug, dripping with arrogance. The nurses watched her leave. Some looked down, ashamed they had not spoken up. Others looked curious, wondering why she had chosen silence instead of a fight. But no one followed her. No one defended her. And that silence cut deeper than the doctor's words. Outside, the air felt cooler. Amara stopped for a moment on the hospital steps. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let the humiliation wash over her. It burned, but underneath the sting she felt something else stirring. Something she had not expected. It was not despair. It was not defeat. It was determination. For years, Amara had worked behind the scenes, building a career in healthcare administration and business. She had studied the systems, the structures, the failures that plagued hospitals across the country. She knew how they worked, not just medically but financially. And she had always dreamed of creating something better, something fairer. But she had been waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right push. Now that push had come. The doctor thought he had humiliated her. He thought he had silenced her. But in truth, he had lit the fire she had been holding back for far too long. As she walked away from the hospital that night, Amara whispered to herself, "This is not the end. This is only the beginning." She went home, sat at her desk, and opened her laptop. The anger she had felt turned into focus. She pulled out old documents, financial plans, proposals she had drafted years ago but never acted on. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. By the time the sun began to rise, Amara had made calls to her lawyers and business partners. She had sent emails to investors who had once shown interest in her vision. She had outlined the steps she would take, and she had made a decision that would change everything, not just for her, but for every person who would ever walk into that hospital again. She was not going to let the doctor's words define her. She was going to redefine the entire hospital itself, and tomorrow, she would return, not as a patient, but as the owner. That night after leaving the hospital, Amara sat in her small but warmly decorated apartment, staring at the ceiling. The humiliation from earlier still echoed in her chest, but the longer she thought about it, the less it hurt and the more it hardened her. She had faced rejection before, but never in such a public and demeaning way. For a brief moment, she thought about what might have happened if she had shouted back at the doctor, demanded respect, or made a scene. But she knew in her heart that silence was her greatest answer. She did not need to prove herself to a man who had already decided her worth. What she needed was to prove to herself once again that she had the power to change everything. Amara's life had never been simple. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood where her mother raised 3 children on her own. Her father had left early, and her mother worked 2 jobs to make sure they never went to bed hungry. Amara learned resilience at a young age. She studied by candlelight when the electricity was cut off, wore second-hand clothes that never quite fit, and found joy in books borrowed from the library. Knowledge became her refuge. When kids around her gave up, she pressed forward. When teachers underestimated her, she worked twice as hard. By the time she was a teenager, Amara had developed a quiet strength that made people notice her. She won scholarships, entered programs for gifted students, and eventually earned a degree in healthcare administration. She always believed the healthcare system could be better, could serve people equally, no matter who they were. But every time she spoke about it, people smiled politely and brushed her ideas aside. They told her she was young, inexperienced, and should wait her turn. So she waited, but while she waited, she also worked. She saved money, studied financial models, shadowed hospital boards, and built connections with people who believed in her dream of building hospitals that treated every person with dignity. What no one in that waiting room knew was that Amara was not just another patient. She was already a successful entrepreneur who had invested in small clinics across the state. She had partners who trusted her vision. She had a foundation of knowledge and resources. The hospital she walked into that day was not just a place for her to seek treatment. It was a place she had been studying for months, quietly reviewing its weaknesses and potential. The cruel words of the doctor had not stopped her. They had simply accelerated the timeline she had already envisioned. Sitting at her desk that night, Amara opened files she had been compiling for years. Spreadsheets with numbers, proposals she had written but never sent, drafts of business plans waiting for the right spark. Now she had the spark. She remembered every patient in that waiting room, every silent nurse, every pair of eyes that had witnessed her humiliation. She thought of all the people who had likely walked through those doors before her and been treated as if their dignity did not matter. She could not change what had happened to her, but she could change what would happen to others. Her phone buzzed with a message from one of her close friends, Maya, who had been urging her to start her own hospital for years. "Don't let this break you," the message read. "Let it make you. You know who you are, Amara. You know what you're capable of. This is the moment." Amara read the words and smiled faintly. She knew Maya was right. She poured herself a cup of coffee, rolled up her sleeves, and began to type. She sent an email to her attorney, explaining that she wanted to finalize the acquisition of the hospital immediately. It was bold, maybe reckless, but Amara had never been one to shy away from bold decisions. She had been preparing for this move for years, and now her heart told her it was time. Her mind drifted back to the doctor's voice. "You aren't welcome here." She let the words repeat in her head until they lost their sting. Instead of pain, they became fuel. They became the very reason she would not give up. She whispered to herself, If I am not welcome, then I will create a place where everyone is welcome. No one will ever hear those words again. By midnight, she had already spoken with her investors. They trusted her vision and respected her persistence. One of them said, "If you're ready, Amara, we're ready." Those words wrapped around her like a promise. The humiliation of the day turned into empowerment. She was not just reacting to cruelty. She was stepping into the destiny she had been building all along. As dawn broke, the sky painted in soft hues of pink and gold, Amara leaned back in her chair. Her apartment was filled with papers scattered across the desk, coffee cups half full, and sticky notes with reminders and goals. She was exhausted, but her spirit was alive in a way it had not been in years. She thought about her mother, who had always told her, "One day, you'll be the one to open the doors for others." Amara realized that day had arrived sooner than she expected. But deep down, Amara also felt the weight of the challenge ahead. Owning a hospital was not just about signing papers and walking in as the new leader. It was about transforming a culture, rebuilding trust, and creating an environment where people truly believed in fairness. She knew the staff would doubt her, the doctor would resist her, and the system itself would test her. But none of that scared her. She had been tested all her life, and every test had shaped her into the woman who was ready for this fight. That night, as she finally allowed herself to rest for a few hours, Amara whispered a prayer of strength. She asked not for revenge, but for courage, not for pride, but for wisdom. She wanted to build something greater than herself, something that would outlive the memory of humiliation and replace it with the memory of hope. The hospital that had shut its doors on her was about to become the place she would open to the world. Tomorrow, she would walk back through those same doors, but this time she would not sit quietly in a waiting room, waiting for someone else's approval. She would stand as the new owner. She would stand as the woman who turned pain into purpose, and she would show them all that true strength is not in tearing people down, but in lifting them up. The struggle behind her eyes was not weakness. It was the quiet, unshakable strength of someone who had been underestimated all her life and was ready to rise. Morning sunlight slipped through the blinds of Amara's apartment, and with it came a sense of clarity she had not felt in years. The night before, she had put her entire heart into plans that once felt like distant dreams. Now they were real. She had signed the documents, spoken to her investors, and received confirmation from her lawyers. It was official. The hospital that turned her away was now hers. She stood in front of the mirror that morning, staring at her own reflection. She saw the tired eyes of a woman who had not slept much, but behind them was something brighter, an unshakable light that spoke of victory. She thought of the doctor's harsh words again, but instead of anger, a small smile tugged at her lips. Today, she would walk into that same hospital, but not as a patient seeking help. She would walk in as the owner. As she dressed, she chose her clothes carefully. No jeans, no hoodie. Today, she wore a fitted suit, simple yet commanding. Her natural curls were styled with care, and she carried herself with quiet confidence. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was not trying to seek validation. She simply wanted to walk in as her true self, strong, calm, and ready. The ride to the hospital felt surreal. The city moved around her as it always did, with buses honking, people rushing to work, and children laughing on their way to school. But for Amara, the world seemed to slow down. Every red light, every passing face, every building she passed reminded her that she was about to change not just her own story, but the story of every person who would one day step into that hospital. When she finally arrived, she paused for a moment outside the hospital doors. The same doors she had exited less than 24 hours earlier, with humiliation heavy in her chest. Now she stood tall, her chin lifted. The nurses inside were going about their morning routines, unaware of what was about to happen. She took one last breath and walked in. At first, no one noticed. The receptionist looked up briefly, then back down at her computer. A few patients sat quietly in the waiting area, coughing, scrolling through their phones, or looking at the clock. Then the staff began to recognize her. Whispers spread like ripples through water. The woman who had been turned away yesterday was back. Their eyes widened, confused, curious, even anxious. The doctor was in the middle of giving instructions to two nurses when he saw her. His expression shifted immediately, first surprise, then annoyance. "You again?" he said, his voice sharp. "I thought I made myself clear." "You don't belong here." Amara did not flinch. She did not shrink under his words this time. Instead, she walked forward with steady steps until she stood directly in front of him. She pulled a folder from her bag and placed it in his hands. "Actually," she said calmly, her voice even but powerful, "I do belong here. In fact, I own this hospital now." The room fell silent. The doctor blinked, staring at the papers as if they were written in another language. The nurses glanced at each other in disbelief. The receptionist stood up from her desk, her mouth slightly open. Patients looked up, sensing something important was unfolding. "You, what?" The doctor stammered, his face flushing red. Amara looked him directly in the eyes. "As of this morning, this hospital is under new ownership." "My ownership? Yesterday you told me I wasn't welcome here. Today I am here to make sure everyone is." Her words rang through the air, sharp but graceful. The nurses who had felt powerless the day before now felt a rush of admiration. Some even smiled faintly as if silently cheering for her. The doctor, however, clenched his jaw, his pride visibly wounded. He tossed the folder onto the counter and scoffed. "This is ridiculous. You don't know how to run a hospital. You think money is enough? You'll fail in a week." Amara did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her calmness carried more power than his arrogance. "You are right about one thing," she said. "Running a hospital isn't just about money. It's about people. About compassion. About treating every human being with respect. That is something you seem to have forgotten, and that is why things are about to change." The room erupted in whispers. Nurses who had stayed silent yesterday now stood a little taller. Some of them exchanged approving nods. The doctor, caught between disbelief and fury, tried to regain control. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll regret this." Amara leaned in slightly, her voice soft but steady. "The only thing I regret is that people like you have been allowed to represent medicine for so long. If you want to stay here, you will learn to treat every patient with dignity. If not, you are free to leave." Her words were not just directed at him, but at everyone listening. They carried a weight that was undeniable. She turned away from him and addressed the staff as a whole. "From this day forward, this hospital will be a place of healing for everyone, without discrimination, without arrogance. No one will ever hear the words, 'You aren't welcome here' again. Not in my hospital." The nurses clapped quietly at first, then louder until the sound filled the room. Even some of the patients smiled, their eyes shining with hope. For the first time, the hospital did not feel cold or unwelcoming. It felt alive, renewed, touched by the spirit of change. The doctor stood frozen, his authority crumbling before his eyes. He had ruled the hospital through fear and arrogance, but in a single morning, that power had shifted. Amara had not shouted, had not insulted him, she had simply revealed the truth, and the truth was undeniable. Later that day, as Amara walked through the halls with her lawyers and partners, she noticed the way people looked at her. Some were still skeptical, unsure if she could really handle the role. Others were inspired, grateful to see someone willing to challenge the system. Amara did not expect everyone to accept her immediately. She knew respect had to be earned, not demanded, but she also knew that she had already taken the first step. When she finally sat in the office that once belonged to the hospital's previous owner, she closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of her mother, of Maya's encouraging words, of every rejection she had faced along the way. She thought of the humiliation she endured less than 24 hours earlier, and how it had turned into the foundation of her greatest victory. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Maya. "Well, did you do it?" Amara typed back a single sentence. "I walked in as the owner." She set the phone down and looked around the office. The work ahead would be hard, maybe harder than anything she had ever done. But she was ready. She was no longer the woman sitting quietly in a waiting room, holding back tears. She was the woman who had turned pain into strength. The return of strength was not about pride. It was about purpose. And Amara knew she had found hers. The next morning felt different for everyone in the hospital. News had spread quickly, not just among the staff but also throughout the community. Patients arriving for their appointments whispered to one another about the woman who now owned the building. Nurses gathered in the break room before their shifts, exchanging nervous but hopeful glances. Some were excited about the change, others uncertain, and a few openly worried about what this might mean for their jobs. One thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. Amara arrived quietly, her heels clicking against the tiled floor as she walked through the entrance. The same receptionist who had ignored her days ago now stood up straighter and greeted her with respect. Amara nodded politely but did not linger. She had work to do. Her eyes were focused, her mind steady. This was not about revenge. It was about restoration. She had taken ownership not to humiliate anyone but to prove that compassion and fairness could lead a hospital to greatness. But the doctor, the same man who had humiliated her in front of everyone, was not ready to accept this change. He had been with the hospital for years, prided himself on his authority, and could not imagine answering to the very woman he had dismissed as unworthy. His pride burned like fire. He paced in his office, muttering under his breath about how unfair it all was, how impossible it was that she now held the power. He told himself she would fail, that she would not survive a week in control. And he decided he would make sure of it. When Amara called the first official meeting with the staff, the air in the conference room was tense. Nurses sat in neat rows, their expressions cautious. Administrative staff scribbled notes, waiting to see what direction the new owner would take. The doctor sat near the front, his arms crossed tightly, his jaw clenched. He wanted her to fail, wanted her to stumble, wanted to prove that she was nothing more than a woman playing a role too big for her. Amara stood at the front of the room, calm and composed. She looked at each face, meeting their eyes, acknowledging their presence. Then she began to speak. Yesterday I walked through these halls as a patient seeking care, and I was turned away. I was told I did not belong here. I left humiliated, but I returned today not with anger but with a vision. This hospital will no longer be a place where dignity is denied. It will be a place where every human being is treated with respect no matter who they are. Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Some of the staff shifted in their seats, moved by her sincerity. Others nodded in agreement. The doctor smirked, his eyes narrowed, waiting for a chance to strike. When she paused, he leaned forward, his voice loud and cutting. With all due respect, owning a hospital is not the same as running one. You think words and promises are enough? This is medicine, not a charity. Patients don't need speeches. They need real doctors who know what they're doing. What experience do you have? None. You'll sink this place in a month. Gasps spread through the room. The challenge was direct, sharp, and meant to undermine her. All eyes turned to Amara, waiting to see how she would respond. She did not rush. She allowed the silence to linger, her steady gaze fixed on him. Then with measured calm, she spoke. You are right about one thing. Patients do need doctors who know what they're doing, but they also need doctors who know how to care. A hospital is not just about procedures and prescriptions. It is about humanity. When you told me I wasn't welcome here, you showed everyone what kind of doctor you are. Not one of care, but of pride. And that is why I am here now. Not to replace medicine, but to restore compassion to it. The room was silent again, but this time the silence was not tense. It was thoughtful. The staff felt the truth in her words. Many of them had worked under the doctor's harsh leadership for years, carrying out orders without question, watching him belittle patients and colleagues alike. They had learned to stay quiet, but deep down they longed for change. The doctor's face turned red, his fists clenched at his sides. You think you can lecture me on compassion? I've saved lives while you've sat behind a desk. You don't belong in my world. Amara took a step closer, her voice still calm but firmer now. This is not your world. It is ours, all of ours. And if you want to remain in this hospital, you will have to learn that. If you cannot, then perhaps this is no longer the place for you. Her words hit like a stone against glass. The doctor's pride cracked. He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, one of the senior nurses spoke up. She's right, the nurse said softly but firmly. This hospital has lost its heart. We've all felt it. Maybe it's time for something new. Others nodded, murmurs of agreement spreading through the room. For the first time, the doctor realized he was standing alone. His authority, once unquestioned, was slipping through his fingers. Amara looked around the room, her expression warm now. I am not here to take away what you've built, she said, her voice steady. I am here to make it stronger. Together we can create a hospital that people trust. But it starts with respect. It starts with compassion. And it starts with each of you. The meeting ended with a mix of hope and tension, but the shift was undeniable. The staff began to see her not as an outsider, but as a leader. The doctor stormed out, furious, but deep down he knew the truth. His reign was over. Later that day, Amara walked through the corridors again, greeting patients, listening to nurses, asking questions about what needed to change. She wasn't just giving orders, she was listening. And that, more than anything, won the hearts of those who had doubted her. The confrontation had not been about shouting or anger. It had been about truth, and the truth was simple. Compassion had returned to the hospital, and with it a new kind of strength. The days following that tense meeting were some of the most important of Amara's life. For the first time, she was no longer planning change in the quiet of her apartment or writing proposals that might never leave her desk. Now she was walking the halls of a hospital that carried her name, her vision, and her responsibility. Every patient, every nurse, every janitor and receptionist, each of them looked at her differently now. Some with hope, some with skepticism, some with quiet doubt. She understood their feelings. Change was never easy, and trust was not given overnight. But Amara was not afraid of the work ahead. She had carried the weight of struggle all her life, and she knew how to carry this one too. Her first steps were small but powerful. She began by listening. Instead of locking herself away in the office upstairs, she spent her mornings walking the hospital floor. She asked patients about their experiences, sat with families in the waiting rooms, and listened to the stories of nurses who had been working here for decades. She wrote everything down. Every concern, every suggestion, every detail about what could be improved. It surprised the staff. They were used to leaders who made decisions from above, who cared more about numbers than people. But here was Amara, the new owner, bending down to talk to a child in the pediatric wing, or sitting quietly beside an elderly woman who had been waiting for hours. One afternoon, she found herself in the cafeteria, not eating alone at the executive table, but sharing lunch with the cleaning staff. They told her about the broken machines that made their work harder, about the long shifts that often went unnoticed. Amara listened, nodding, promising to make changes, and she meant every word. The janitor, an older man named Samuel, looked at her with misty eyes and said, "You're the first person who's ever asked us what we need. That means more than you know." Those words stayed with her. Meanwhile, the doctor who had once humiliated her grew restless. He still carried his pride like armor, but every day he saw the hospital shifting in ways he could not control. Patients greeted Amara warmly. Nurses found new courage in her leadership, and even the administrative staff felt a spark of motivation. He scoffed when he saw her walking the halls, calling it a performance, but deep down, he felt something unfamiliar, a quiet fear that maybe she was exactly what the hospital had needed all along. Amara did not stop at small gestures. She began implementing real change. She introduced diversity and compassion training for the entire staff, something unheard of in that hospital's history. She created a policy that ensured every patient, regardless of race, income, or background, received equal care. She pushed for financial assistance programs for families who struggled to pay their bills. When people told her it was too ambitious, she smiled and said, "Ambition is how we grow." At first there was resistance. Some staff members grumbled about the new rules. Some worried about the cost of her programs. But slowly, as the changes took root, the hospital began to transform. Waiting times grew shorter because staff worked more efficiently together. Patients left with smiles instead of frustration. Nurses, who once felt invisible under the doctor's shadow, now felt seen and respected. They began to give more of themselves because they felt valued. One evening, Amara walked past the emergency room and saw something that nearly brought tears to her eyes. A young nurse was kneeling beside a patient, holding their hand, speaking softly to calm them. The patient was crying, scared, but the nurse's calm words soothed them. Other nurses nearby were moving quickly but not frantically. They were working as a team. It was the picture of what Amara had dreamed of for years, a hospital where humanity and medicine worked hand in hand. She thought back to the night she walked out of the same building with humiliation burning in her chest. If someone had told her then that in less than a week she would witness this kind of compassion blossoming within its walls, she might not have believed it. But now she was seeing it with her own eyes. The transformation was not complete yet, but it had begun, and there was no turning back. Of course, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, when the hospital was quieter, Amara sat in her office, staring at piles of paperwork, wondering if she had taken on more than she could handle. The responsibilities were endless: budgets, staffing, supplies, compliance with regulations. The weight of it pressed on her shoulders. But then she would remember her mother's words. When the world tells you no, find a way to say yes. Those words had carried her through dark times before, and they carried her now. The community began to notice the change, too. Word spread about the hospital that had once been cold and unwelcoming, but now felt alive with compassion. Families who had avoided it for years returned, grateful for the new atmosphere. Patients wrote letters praising the staff, something that had not happened in years. Local newspapers ran stories about the new owner who was transforming healthcare in her city. Amara did not seek the attention, but she welcomed the opportunity for her message to spread, that every human being deserves dignity. Even the skeptical staff began to shift. One day, a senior nurse approached Amara privately and admitted, "When you first came here, I didn't think you would last. But I was wrong. You've given this hospital something we didn't even know we had lost." Amara thanked her, but she knew it was not just her. It was all of them. She had opened the door, but it was the staff who had chosen to walk through it. And then one unexpected moment cemented the transformation in everyone's eyes. A patient, a young boy who had been seriously ill, was discharged after weeks of treatment. His mother hugged Amara in the hallway, tears streaming down her face. "You don't know what this means to us," she said. "You've given me my son back, and you've given this city hope." Amara held her gently, her own eyes wet, realizing that this was what it was all about. Not ownership, not power, not even pride. It was about lives, about hope, about making sure no one ever felt unwelcome again. The transformation of the hospital was not finished, but the foundation was strong. Amara had turned humiliation into purpose and purpose into progress. She had taken a place that once closed its doors to her and opened them wide for everyone else. And as she walked those halls late at night, hearing the steady rhythm of footsteps, the quiet hum of machines, and the soft voices of staff caring for patients, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. For days, the doctor moved like a shadow through the hospital corridors. His once commanding presence no longer carried the same weight. He noticed it in the way nurses did not jump at his orders as quickly as before, in the way patients no longer looked past him with fear, but instead looked toward Amara with gratitude. His pride, which had been his armor for so long, now felt more like a burden he could not put down. Every time he saw Amara walking with calm authority, speaking softly to a patient or listening intently to a nurse's concerns, he felt his chest tighten. He had thought her ownership was a joke, a temporary disruption. But the longer he watched, the more he realized something he had never wanted to admit. She was changing the hospital for the better. It was a slow realization, one that crept in when he was alone at night, staring at his own reflection in the mirror. He had dedicated his life to medicine, yes, but somewhere along the way he had lost the heart of it. He had built walls of arrogance to protect himself from exhaustion and disappointment, but those walls had also cut him off from compassion. Watching Amara, he saw something he had long forgotten, the simple humanity of the profession. Still, admitting this to himself was painful. He clung to his bitterness, telling himself that her changes would fail eventually, that patients would lose faith, that the staff would grow tired of her speeches. Yet every day the opposite happened. Patients left with smiles. Nurses carried themselves with pride. Even the atmosphere in the cafeteria had changed. Lighter, warmer, filled with laughter he had not heard in years. One afternoon, he witnessed something that finally broke through his pride. He had been called to the pediatric ward to consult on a case. A little girl was crying, frightened of the machines around her, her small hands trembling as the nurse tried to calm her. Before he could step in, Amara knelt beside the bed. She did not speak right away. She simply held the child's hand, her eyes warm and steady. Slowly, the child's sobs quieted. Amara pulled a small toy from her bag, a simple stuffed animal, and placed it in the girl's hands. The child smiled faintly, clutching it tightly. The doctor stood frozen in the doorway, watching. It was not medicine that had soothed the child. It was compassion, something he had once offered freely long ago, but now seemed incapable of giving. He felt a pang in his chest, not anger this time, but regret. Later that evening, he sat in his office, staring at the pile of patient files on his desk. He thought about the man he used to be, the young doctor who had entered this field with dreams of saving lives and helping people. Somewhere along the way, he had allowed pride and prejudice to take root, and they had poisoned the way he treated others. He had thought authority made him powerful, but now he saw how small it had made him. For the first time in years, he felt ashamed. The next morning, he saw Amara in the hallway. She was reviewing charts with a group of nurses, her tone calm and respectful. He hesitated, his pride warring with his conscience, but finally he stepped forward. The nurses fell silent, sensing the tension. Amara turned to face him, her expression neutral, waiting. "I need to speak with you," he said quietly. She nodded and led him into her office. It was simple, neat, filled with notes and patient feedback pinned on the walls. She gestured for him to sit. He hesitated again before finally lowering himself into the chair across from her. For a long moment he could not find the words. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy. But finally he spoke. "I was wrong," he admitted. The words came slowly, but they came. "The way I treated you. The way I've treated others. It was wrong. I've let pride get in the way of what I should have been doing all along. And I am sorry." Amara studied him, her eyes calm but searching. She did not rush to answer. Finally she spoke. "Words matter, but actions matter more. Do you truly want to change, or do you just want to ease your guilt?" Her question cut deep. He swallowed hard. "I want to change," he said softly. "I don't know how to undo the years I spent building walls, but I want to learn again. If you'll let me, I want to help this hospital the way it's meant to be helped." For the first time, she saw sincerity in his eyes. Not pride, not arrogance, but a genuine humility that surprised her. She nodded slowly. "If you're serious, then start with your patients. Treat every one of them with dignity, no matter who they are. Show them the care you once promised when you took your oath. That will speak louder than any apology." The doctor felt a lump in his throat. He nodded, his eyes moist, and stood. "I will." The days that followed tested him. At first, the nurses were cautious around him, waiting to see if his words were real. Patients looked at him with hesitation, their memories of his coldness still fresh. But slowly he began to change. He took extra time with patients, listening to their fears instead of dismissing them. He spoke to the nurses with respect, even gratitude. He even apologized directly to a few patients he had treated poorly in the past, something no one had ever seen him do before. The transformation was not instant, but it was visible. The staff began to see a different side of him. Patients began to trust him again. And Amara, watching quietly, knew that he had finally started to understand. One evening, after a long day, he found Amara in the cafeteria. She was reviewing notes with a cup of coffee, her shoulders tired but her spirit steady. He approached her, not with arrogance this time, but with quiet respect. "I don't know if I've ever said this before," he told her, "but you've reminded me why I became a doctor. I had forgotten, and I'm grateful." Amara smiled faintly, her eyes soft. "Then let's move forward. This hospital isn't about you or me. It's about everyone who walks through these doors. As long as we remember that, we won't go wrong." For the first time in years, the doctor felt peace. It was not easy to confront his failures, but in doing so, he found a part of himself he thought was lost. And he knew Amara had given him a second chance, not just as a doctor, but as a human being. The doctor's realization was not just his own victory. It was proof that change was possible, even for those who had lost their way. And it was a reminder to everyone in the hospital that compassion had the power to transform not just buildings, but people. The hospital corridors were different now. What once carried the heavy silence of fear and arrogance now echoed with the sounds of healing, soft laughter between nurses, gentle conversations between patients and doctors, the rhythm of footsteps that no longer felt rushed with impatience but steady with purpose. Amara often walked those halls late at night, not because she had to, but because she wanted to see for herself the transformation she had fought so hard to create. Each time she passed a room and saw a nurse holding a patient's hand or a doctor explaining carefully instead of dismissing, her heart grew lighter. She knew change was never perfect, never finished, but she also knew something remarkable had been born here. Word of her story spread far beyond the hospital walls. Local newspapers had first reported it with curiosity, calling it an unusual turn of events when a woman who had been denied treatment became the hospital's owner overnight. But as time passed, the coverage deepened. Journalists wrote about the program she implemented, the policies she reformed, the way she put patients at the center of everything. One national magazine ran a headline that read, "From Rejection to Revolution, How Amara Johnson transformed healthcare with compassion. She became a symbol, not just in her community, but across the country. Her name was spoken in boardrooms, classrooms, and community centers as a reminder that resilience could change entire systems. Amara, however, never sought the spotlight. When reporters asked for interviews, she accepted only to speak about the mission, not about herself. "This was never about me," she would say. "This was about dignity, about creating a place where every person feels they belong. My story is only one example of what happens when you refuse to let rejection define you." Her humility made her story even more powerful, because it reminded people that true leadership is not about standing above others, but standing with them. Inside the hospital, the staff began to feel proud of where they worked. Nurses who had once considered leaving now stayed, inspired by the culture of respect. Young doctors applied eagerly, hoping to be part of something bigger than themselves. The hospital became known as a place where patients were not just treated but cared for. Families drove from other towns to receive care there, knowing they would not be judged, rushed, or dismissed. One afternoon, Amara received a letter from a young woman who had read her story in the paper. The letter said, "I wanted to become a doctor, but I was told people like me don't belong in medicine. After hearing about what you've done, I've decided I won't give up. I will apply again. Thank you for showing me it's possible." Amara held the letter for a long time, her eyes misting. She realized then that her story was no longer just hers. It had become a seed planted in countless others. A reminder that resilience can inspire resilience, that strength can spark strength. Even the doctor who once humiliated her became part of her legacy. Over time, his transformation deepened. He no longer barked orders but asked questions, no longer dismissed patients but listened to them. Some days he would quietly watch Amara speaking to staff and feel a surge of gratitude for the second chance she had given him. One day, in a rare moment of openness, he admitted to her, "If you had turned me away the way I turned you away, I would have deserved it. But instead you gave me a chance to change. That is something I will never forget." His words became a quiet confession of what compassion can accomplish, even in the hardest of hearts. Years passed, and the hospital became a model for others. Amara was invited to speak at conferences where she shared not grand theories but simple truths. Listen to people, respect them, never let pride replace humanity. She told her story of humiliation not to dwell on pain, but to show the power of turning pain into purpose. Each time she spoke, people leaned forward, captivated not by her title or her power, but by her sincerity. In her office, Amara kept one small reminder of the moment that started it all. A simple notebook filled with her scribbles from the night she decided to buy the hospital. On its first page she had written, "This is not the end. This is only the beginning." She smiled each time she saw it, knowing how true those words had been. Her mother, who had once worked long hours to raise her, visited the hospital one afternoon. As she walked the halls with Amara, tears filled her eyes. "You've done what I always prayed you would," her mother whispered. "You've opened doors for others. You've made sure no one will ever feel the way you did that day." Amara hugged her tightly, grateful for the sacrifices that had made this moment possible. The legacy of resilience was not written in headlines or awards, though Amara received both. It was written in the quiet gratitude of patients, the renewed purpose of staff, and the countless lives touched by compassion. It was written in the way people spoke her name, not with awe but with respect. And for Amara, the true measure of her journey was never about ownership, power, or even recognition. It was about the promise she had kept, to herself, to her community, to everyone who had ever been told they were not welcome. She had turned the cruelest words into the foundation of hope. Years later, when she looked back on that humiliating day in the waiting room, she no longer felt the sting. Instead, she felt gratitude, for it was in that moment of rejection that her greatest purpose had been born. And she knew that as long as people remembered her story, they would carry with them the lesson she had lived. Rejection is not the end, but often the beginning of something far greater. The hospital's lights glowed softly at night, a beacon in the community. People no longer whispered about it as a place of arrogance, but spoke of it as a place of healing, fairness, and hope. And at the heart of it all was Amara Johnson, the woman who had once been told she was not welcome, but who turned those words into a legacy that would outlive her. Her resilience had become a gift to the world.